Hey, this is Eric with programwitheric.com, and today we're talking about the Phoenix framework. So the Phoenix framework, if you don't know, is a web development framework. It's written in Elixir, and it uses the server-side pattern, MVC pattern. Elixir is more of a functional language that leverages the Erlang VM, and I'm not going to get into too many specifics why you should use the Phoenix framework, but definitely one reason is speed. There's been a lot of different benchmark tests and a lot of people testing different frameworks. Phoenix is pretty similar, has some similar features as Rails right now, so it's come a long way recently. You can see here some latency here. Lower the better. Obviously it's really fast, but it's definitely getting used to Elixir. It does take a little bit to wrap your head around it. So to install, let's go into a little bit about to install it. You can look at the guides. I'll include the show note. I'll include the links in the description below, but essentially you have to first install Elixir, and there's tons of different ways to install Elixir. If you're in Mac OS, I just use Brew. Make sure you update Brew first. One time I tried to install Elixir and I didn't do the Brew update first, and I got an old version of Elixir and that didn't work with Phoenix correctly. If you're using Mac ports, you can use the sudo port. Unix, you can use apt-get. Depending on what distribution, you can do an apt-get after you add the repo. So there's quite a few ways to install it. I'm not going to get into specifics because I already installed it. And then you want to use, you can use any kind of, usually they recommend using Postgres SQL, but you can use MySQL or whatever versions that you want for your database. But for simplicity's sake, we'll use the default. And so after you get those two installed, I would then install Phoenix itself. And if you look from the installation page, if you look installation, you have to, once you install Elixir, it comes with Mix, which is kind of a tooling to help you to create your Phoenix applications, and then you'll install Hex, which is like your package manager. And then once you have both those installed, you can then do the Mix archive install, which will then download everything you need to start generating Phoenix applications. And then that comes with a bunch of other things like Plug, Cowboy, Ecto. I'm not going to get into that too much. Also, by the way, you'll need Node.js. So that's how you get started here. Okay, since we have everything installed, let's go ahead and try to create a project. So, as long as we have Elixir installed, we can run mix. And we'll go ahead and run mix Phoenix new. And we'll call this app. And we'll do --no HTML --no brunch. And what this says is go ahead and just create, hit a yes here. What this tells Mix to do is to create the scaffolding for our Phoenix project, but not include any of the HTML files, and don't include brunch. And the reason we don't want either one of these is this is going to be just a app backend API for our Ember front end. So now, since we went ahead and created everything, it tells you exactly here what to do, by the way. We can just change directory to the app, Mix Phoenix server. And if we want to run it in interactive mode, we can run this command here. And then it also recommends we run mix ecto create. So if we go ahead and change directory to app, now we can go ahead and take a look what was created. So I'm going to open up Vim here, and all these directories were created. We took a look at our web. We can see scaffolding that was created. There's not a whole lot in here, but if we go to, there's a lot of files, but nothing's done with it. If we go into the dev.exs file, you can see here's the default Postgres username and password, and the database that it'll be creating, and so we'll just keep that in mind. Since when I set up Postgres, I just left the defaults. I left the name Postgres as the password, so we won't need to change any of this. So let's go ahead and do mix ecto create. Now, ecto is a library that Phoenix uses and Mix uses to handle the database. It talks to our database and handles creating everything for us. So we'll let it do its thing here. Okay, the app has been created, so we can just make sure it works by running Phoenix server here. And it's running on port 4000. We'll go ahead and go to localhost port 4000. And you can see it's up. Here we have our app router. It tells us we don't really have anything set yet. No route found because we haven't done anything. But at least this way we know that we have it installed correctly. And you can see the error here. So let's go ahead, and we want to use a serializer for JSON API. If you're not familiar, the default way that Ember works now is a specification called JSON API, and we can use this to our advantage. We're going to want to make sure our backend Phoenix returns data in this format. So we can use something called Serializer, and if I'll just Google it right here, and if we go to it, it gives us information on how to install it. So let's go ahead and install it real quickly. So the first thing, we need to go to Mix, and we'll add it as a dependency. And per the documentation, we need to add it here. So these are all the dependencies that come pre-packaged inside our Phoenix app. So we'll just add Serializer there. And then we need to go into the config and go into the config EXS file. And before the bottom here, before this config, we'll go ahead and add in the rest. Copy and paste it. And this just says, just tells it to use the JSON API and then use this for this type of application to use this JSON API when this MIME type comes through. And that should be it for just creating it. Starting off creating it here, so we can run a few other things to make sure everything's working right. So we'll run this deps get, and this will go ahead and get our Serializer package. And once again, the hex is the package manager. So hex went ahead and downloaded everything we needed. And this is kind of weird, but it tells us to touch this file and then to do a compile. And that's just inside the directions for Serializer. Just make sure everything, all the plugs are getting loaded correctly since we changed that to config file. And then finally, it recommends that we can also run this command at the end. The environment's already, it sets the environment to test and then compiles the plug again. And this is all just inside the standard directions inside the GitHub of what to do to get everything working. Right there. So now since we have all that done, we can go back into our router. And we'll go to our router. And we can see here we have a /API, pipeline through API. we have this accepts, but we're going to change this from JSON to JSON API that we set up earlier. And that should be it there. So let's just start it again, make sure everything's okay. Okay. And we'll just reload this, still working. We can go to /API. Still no routes yet, but we have everything set up. And one thing we can also do is this, by default it has a lot of information on what's happening. When you get an error, it tells you the headers, the request info, where inside it was looking and there's no match for it. But we can turn that off, and this is entirely up to you, but if we go to debug errors right here, you can turn this to false. This is also where you can change the port. If you don't want it to 4000, you can change it to something else. So now, if we run Mix Phoenix Server again, and we reload it, now we get a standard error page that just tells us that it wasn't found. Kind of like that better. Obviously in production you'd want to make sure that you were returning the correct errors, but for now I just wanted to let people know you can turn that on or off. And since we have everything installed here, we can go ahead and the Mix also, if you install the Serializer, you can use the generator, because the Mix has several generators, and you can create different things. So in this command here will create the model for us, teacher. The first, you can see here, this is the Generate Phoenix API. So, and by convention you put the singular version and then the plural version of the model, and then the name and the string, and you can put the name, which is the field, and age, and you just define what it is. So we'll go ahead and run that. And you can see here it created a bunch of files for us. It created the change set. This is part of Ecto, and this is how it creates, it's kind of a migration file that will create the stuff in the database for us. We have the controller. It also creates the views, creates the model, and some test information. Actually, excuse me, the migration's right here for it, and it creates the change set for us too. So let's go ahead and do what we need to do next, which is echo migrate. One second. Oh, there's one other thing we need to do before we do the migration, is we need to actually add it into the router. So if we go back into web and go to router, we have this pipe through API, but we actually need to set the resource here. And what this tells is that we're going to have, under API, we're going to have a teacher's resource, and it's going to be everything except new and edit, and I'll explain that in a second. But let's see if that works now. Great. So what it did is it created the database, compiled everything together, and it created everything we need to get started here. Now, I was telling you about, we can also run this command, Phoenix routes, and you can see here that it created, the generator created all these routes for us. So now we have the teacher controller. If you went to did a get command in HTTP GET for app teacher controller, it's actually in the index. If you specify individual ID, it's going to go to show. If you do app teachers, you can also do a post to that, and it would go to create. And these are actually inside the controller, and I'll show you that in a second. And these are all automatically generated with us from the JSON generator. So if I go back to the web and controllers, and we're going through this pretty quickly, but this is just a quick overview. This was all completely generated by the generator, and you can see here we have an index, we have a create, we have a show, we have an update, and those correspond to what we saw before. For example, if you just do a HTTP GET request, it's going to go to this index here. It's going to grab everything in this repo.all as part of Ecto. It grabs everything from the teacher database, and then it essentially just shows it, it renders it inside the system for us in index.json. If we go to views, teacher view, there's nothing really it's doing here otherwise just showing the data to us in the JSON API format. So before we continue on, we want to add some dummy data for us. So the easiest way to do that is we can go back, we go to private repo seeds, and we'll go ahead and I'm just going to copy and paste some information here. And what this says, let me see if I can format this better. And what this tells us is that we're going to have the teacher. We're going to create two new inserts into our database for the teacher's database, one for Eric and one for Bob. And this tells us to do an enum each on each one of them. If you're using Elixir, you should get used to this pipe command. This tells us we're piping it into the enum each, and it's going to insert each one into the database for us. So after we do that, we can run mix run, and we can just run it. And great, so went ahead and inserted those values into the database. So now we can do one more thing before we take a look. Let's go back and add in one more library. So just in case we have to deal with cross-site origin requests, we can go ahead and install the Coors plugin. So if we go to mix, and we'll just add in this Coors plugin, just in case we have cross-origin requests. And then we can do a deps get again. That makes sure that we use the hex package manager to get the dependency. And then the last thing we need to do is go into lib and go into here. Oops. You want to go to app and then endpoint, and then before the router, we want to make sure we have this plug-in. And this will make sure that we are using everything we need to do for our cross-origin requests. So let's see if the backend API works here. So we'll do mix Phoenix server. Everything's compiled, running. So if we go here, we still don't have anything, but let's go to teachers now. We should have this route. So great, now you can see now it's in the compliant JSON API format. We have our data, we have our attributes for our name, even added a few other ones, inserted at and updated at. We have our teacher attributes. We can also, if we wanted to, we can just choose the first record or the second record. So that's all working. And once again, you can kind of get an idea what's happening if you go into web, and then you can see it first hits the router. Well, it first hits the endpoint. We won't get into that too much, but then it gets into the router. It matches this /API to /teachers. It uses the teacher controller. We don't care about new and edit because we're accepting those too. So we look at the teacher controller. Teacher controller, we know by convention that index is if you don't request any individual parameters. It's just returning the whole. It's using the render function, which returns everything to us. We can also see if we get an ID, it would go into the show here. And this is all part of Elixir, where it uses these uses this mix to ID equals ID1. Oops. And that'll this dictionary here, and it'll get the teacher ID by using repo.get, and then that teacher gets passed into here to be shown. And then if we wanted to do a create, like a post, then the data would be sent over, and it would create the connection and insert it into the database. I'm not going to go into that this time. This video is getting kind of long, so we'll just leave it at that. So since we have the API working, we're going to go ahead and create the server. Mix Phoenix server. And if you ever need help with Elixir by itself, you can go to elixirlang.com, and there's the documents here. You can get tons of information, and to try to understand some of the things we were seeing earlier, definitely has a pretty good getting started guide. We were kind of looking at maps earlier and how that works, and it's good idea to get familiar with how pattern matching works. You're going to be using that a lot, and the way it works with the different methods. So we have the server running now. So I am using screen here, so we can go ahead and take a look at our system here. So I'm going to go ahead and move over to the correct place. Okay. I went ahead and created a Ember app already for us, and inside here we're using the JSON API adapter. It's defaulted, and what I did is I created a route that just returns everything from our teacher model. Our teacher model matches the same model that we would see inside our it matches everything that we would see inside our API that we created. And inside our template, we're going to go ahead and just iterate through that model to display the name and age that'll come from our backend server. So we'll go ahead and we'll start the server. And what this command does is it tells Ember to start running, but to proxy everything over to localhost 4000, which is where the API server is running. And if we open up our localhost, we'll go to 4200, and you can see here our teacher name Eric, teacher age 5. We can inspect it, and we can notice that it looks fine here. If we go to Ember, take a look at our data, retrieve the 2 Ember data options from our backend, just as we expected, because it's really doing a request to 4000 API teachers and grabbing the information for us. So that's basically it for now. This is a quick overview of how to use Phoenix and to get connected to Ember. If you need some more information, check out my article. I have it programmedwitheric.com. I go into a little bit more detail. Thanks, and have a great day.